What is up, down, and sideways, you truly fantastic individuals? It is another episode of League Online. Mark Movies has snuck up on us, but now we were just a few days away from Split 2, Spring Split, whatever you want to call it, in the LEC kicking off, which means we're going to look at some power rankings and primarily say what's changed from spring to winter. We'll kind of revisit where these teams were placed in the preseason. A modest amount of roster moves, primarily in the bottom half of the standings heading into this new split, which is typically the case between winter and spring.
I think in this new era of League of Legends, the three split type of format, and especially in a region like the LEC where we are more familiar with it running through, I find this spring split, the transition from winter to spring, to be that key crucial one. If you're going to show that progression, show that signs to eventually become a champion throughout the summer split and someone that can represent on the international stage. This is a key important split to see where teams have gone from the winter, where they will be in spring, how we're feeling about them, all these type of changes. Important time to check in on the LEC.
And we're checking in with the teams we've seen the least so far in this year. Yes, the bottom two staying. How the results ended in winter, we didn't quite have Rogue bottom two in the preseason. I think Adam coming in did not give the spark of aggression and, differing in playstyle for Rogue. They still have the slowest game time of everybody, and, well, Adam did kind of trash talk some of his teammates. It sounds like they're making no moves on the SK side. They're the team that made the most moves, with Bakata coming in to replace Isma. KOI's coming in to replace Rahel, who apparently the poor team communication was the main reason for the replacement. If you're looking for your Korean import AD carry to be bringing the communication, I don't know what you're doing.
You're doomed to fail from the beginning if that's your setup plan. Well, this is a familiar type of thing that we have seen within the LEC, getting one of these early eliminations from the winter split. Usually teams find an opportunity to retool, change things around, sometimes to a more significant degree than what we are seeing here, I think, with SK Gaming, and as far as what you can expect in the results. I don't see anything going different for either of these two squads hanging out at the very basement of the LEC. For Rogue, I think it was a situation where the optimist, the hopeful side of us were expecting maybe that aggression, that energy and play style from Adam would come across and be brought in through the rest of the team as well. I kind of think it was more so Rogue. It changed how Adam played, is the way that we saw things play out. And he seemed to be a shell of his former self, and Rogue still looked like that last place turtle in the LEC.
Like you're poking with a stick waiting for him to do something, and time again, it wasn't the case for Rogue. Heretics was actually the squad we had at the bottom of the table heading into the winter split, and I think that was a combination of there being so many young rookies and Flackett maybe not being the guy to carry a squad, but these rookies actually had a pretty good debut. I know Heretics didn't have a deep playoff run, but of this kind of the bottom three, I feel most hopeful about the continued development of Camilo and Carlson as those solo laners.
I'm willing to give him a shot, is the way I feel about this in comparison to Rogue and SK, where again, I'm very much so expecting and predicting that it will be more of the same struggles and frustrations that we saw in the winter split, But when you talk about this team and you're identifying for the Heretics what they were able to do right in that winter split, at the very least, there is something that they did right. You did have, I think, maybe a weekend and a half, I think I'd say, of positive action, progression play, and what you were seeing from them. And yes, you can bank on those rookies to hopefully continue to shine, continue to gain experience, and find their footing within that LEC main stage.
And obviously, again, the expectations are not the highest for them, which can be a blessing or a curse depending on the squad. But Flackett actually did step into, you're looking for leadership on a squad like this, and I think him and obviously Sheo coming in. You got three Frenchmen on this roster, so the built-in culture and comms should be improved the more time these young players get more and more time on the Rift. Then we get to, again, one of the other big there weren't that many big moves, so I'm calling this a big one. And that is Isma coming in to replace Closer, who we've seen a resurgence over the last year or two. Sounds like he's taken a break from the competitive scene, which is worrying for this GiantX squad because Closer is a vocal player. You still have Noah and Jun, who you're not going to be looking to as the main communicators. Take note, SK. Jackie's is a young player. Lot is a rookie. So all of a sudden, it feels like there's extra pressure on Jackie's and now Isma to be leading this team. And Isma is coming off of not a good split with SK.
I mean, you can talk about the statistics, you can look at the performance and numbers for Closer, but what is obviously not going to be something that is replaced, as you're talking about, is that veteran presence within that team. Someone who has been around the ecosystem of esports and at that professional level, never mind the LEC as well. This is something that I think is going to be missed from this GiantX team, and a GiantX team that couldn't afford take a step back in the situation heading towards this next split. This is one of those key teams that I want to identify and the transition from winter to spring, and how can you show those signs of improvement that you're keep working towards to eventually look like a representative, a summer champion, this type of thing for a World's Birth appearance. GiantX moving in a direction where I'm not expecting that type of thing to come through, when even with some of the struggles, the ups and downs that we did see in that winter split, I think even going into this next split, you could have envisioned, okay, maybe you solve it around, sort things out, find that groove for this team to put up the results. I don't think that you're going to really see that given the changes that we have with this team and where they needed to bolster themselves.
And remember, there were a 2-week stretch where we were talking about GiantX at the top of the LEC table, but this was best of ones where you don't get the full picture of how good a team is. Now we're heading into spring, and it's a single round robin. Your best of threes hitting the ground running. So it feels like from the get-go, you're going to have a better sense of who the actual top teams in the LEC are.
I think one of the things with the GiantX in that regard in these series that you're going to be paying attention to is, of course, looking at Jackie's, what he's doing in the mid lane, how he's progressing as that individual player. And then I think the bottom lane is the other part that you're going to be checking in with for GiantX and seeing how they're fitting in, where and how far they can really take this team throughout the LEC.
The most out of left field move in the offseason, 100%, comes from Team Vitality. Niski joining the squad as a role swap support to replace the Professor Hillisang in the bot lane. And traditionally, you hear a guy role swapping for the first time, you're going to have a lot of reservations and hesitation. But Hilly had probably his worst split as a pro last year. So even a guy who's never started a game as support, I'm going, maybe it's an upgrade, because we know Niski can be a vocal leader on this team.
And when you go through the statistics for Vitality through that winter split, you're going to find that, no, they weren't one of the best teams, but they weren't one of the bottom teams as well. They find themselves in that middle tier, but in a middle tier where you should be a playoff team. And you should be a playoff team that is going to make a series interesting, whether that's going to be against, as the major underdog against one of the top teams, or a more close together matchup within the standings type of thing. What did we get from Vitality? Because that certainly wasn't what we had from them in the results in the winter split. And a large part of that, yes, can be individually pointed towards Hillisang and some of the choices, some of the decision-making that he was making, and then putting his team in that type of situation afterwards when so many of them were backfiring, were being costly towards his side. It's a situation where even despite all of the history, all of the accolades on his side throughout history, you look at the player in the current form and you can't sign off on that. And so much so that you're willing to bring in someone like Niski, who hasn't had professional experience at that support position, and you're willing to roll the dice on him here. And I think a lot of us are saying, okay, good. We want to see that type of change. And maybe even with the unknowns, the question marks around this move, you think that it can possibly change the fortunes for Vitality.
Yeah, and again, the dynamic, yes, Hilly and Karzi were one of the most polarizing, exciting bot lanes, but they were the veterans of this team. And really, we're looking at the growth I'm looking at Linsis and Chayak in the mid lane. He was top 2 among all mid laners in the LEC in damage percentage, kill participation, and XPD at 15. So he has, I think, really been a surprise in how quickly his development has been. So pairing Niski, a guy who, of course, played mid lane before, to pair up with a guy like him, I think I'm actually kind of excited to see Niski back suiting up for a squad. BDS, we had them 4 in the preseason. They were kind of a lock-in to be that 4th best team, it felt like. And with Irrelevant on this roster, a developing 1-1-3, it felt like this team really never lived up to expectations in winter.
I think this is maybe the biggest underachievers of the winter split from the LEC, and I say that because of what was potentially there for this team, what we saw them, and where, you know, kind of the landscape was changing for the LEC, and the opportunity to jump out in front and again continue leading as one of these emerging teams within the region. You didn't get that from this group this time around. It seemed that you know, the results ended up being weaker than the sum of the parts should have been able to put out for this BDS team. And you look at the statistics again, they don't necessarily paint a very dominant picture for this team and where they find themselves in the hierarchy of the LEC. Need to find a change, a spark, something different this time around throughout the spring split.
And just want to see more impact, more priority for a guy like Irrelevant, who we were talking about as one of the premier free agents heading into this 2025 split after being so good on a team that was so bad. I mean, Fnatic were teams that were in the conversation to maybe get this guy, and him coming to BDS to replace Adam. You wanted more consistency in that top lane, but didn't feel like he was the featured guy very often.
Yeah, it really did feel like a strange choice when you knew that this change was coming through for the winter split, and the opportunities that we talked about with this team and what could happen with a player like Irrelevant there, simply to almost be, a bad pun, an irrelevant option in that top side for this team when they were considering what to do. And then even then, if that's the choice, well, then you got to look at players like Nuke and Ice, who weren't able to step up and take that lead the way that this team really needed in the winter split. So that's got to be where I think my attention is in spring. Either those two have to find a way to step up and be bigger contributors for this team, or look at the angle of finding a way to start maybe playing through Irrelevant in that top side, putting more resources, more attention, more priority up there.
I know we were sipping a little deep on the Hopium Cup for Movistar KOI, partially because our boy JoJo came over. We had them number 2 heading into this winter split, and let's be honest, this is probably the most coin flip team that the LEC had, because you look at the numbers in both the regular season and playoffs, and they were near the top in a lot of categories. We saw them when they won. It was absolute domination, and they looked like a title contender. But when they lost, they were getting equally beat down. And we saw, again, these flashes in playoffs where they looked like they could contend with the very best in the LEC. All we need from this team is consistency, and we're getting fearless from the get-go for your boy Mirren, which, again, should be a nice little check for them.
Yes, and it is, as you talked about before, best of 3 in that Fearless scenario. So we are getting the actual effects of Fearless coming into this one early on in the LEC, and that's something that I think fans of Movistar KOI can be very much so looking forward to. Now, the consistency problems, and that extends to our boy, our star, Mr. Jojo Pyun in the mid lane, as a big part of the engine that drives this team, that sets the tone for the games that they are and how things are going to go from the very beginning of leaving the fountain of Summoner's Rift. He's got to find a way to be more consistent in his own individual performances, his practice, all sorts of things add into that category, because I think the rest of this Movistar KOI, again, put that another one in the Mad Lions jar, is Elyoya. And, you're looking at the rest of this team, and they have the facility to build out to be a champion. But you got to do it day after day after day in the LEC. And we didn't see that throughout the winter split from this Movistar KOI team. Too many days, too many day after day where it is on day, off day type of situation. It's got to be on all the way through, especially with what we expect to be at the very top of the LEC. You got to make a change if you are Movistar KOI from how things were in the winter split,
At least it felt like on the day that was the product you were getting. It wasn't game by game in the series. It was they showed up, they dominate on the Rift, they show up, they get dominated. It wasn't that much variation from game to game, which I guess you can take that as a negative or a positive heading into this spring split. The top three we break down: Fnatic, obviously no strangers to being here, and 60% of the split, they looked like the best team in the entire region. And we saw some bounce back, some pushback, and honestly, they pushed Karmine Corp to the brink more than G2 did by far in those finals. So there's plenty of positives for the black and gold to be taking from that winter split. I think Mickey and Upset coming in immediately gelled well with the team, and they seemed like a more well-oiled machine as a five-man unit than they did last year.
It's a tale of two stories for me with this Fnatic team that went through the winter split, because you go through the regular season part of it, the first part of this, the round robin going through, the numbers are all fantastic. They're all great. They're all the leading of the charts. They're way ahead out of everybody in the LEC, the clear front runners. And then you get to playoffs and the pressure starts creeping in, and then you get the bad performances coming on through, the disjointed dysfunction of this Fnatic team that we are all too familiar with. When these pressure moments happen in the LEC, that's where I got to be keying in. You got to find a way to steel yourself when the things, when there is something on the line, whether it's about, fearing the situation, the fallback, the blowback when you lose, or, over prioritizing, over, dreaming about winning and being the champion in those situations. There's got to be a way to find the balance for this Fnatic team, because clearly it is affecting them when you get to these points, you get to these type of matchups, and it's a different Fnatic team than the Fnatic team we have come to see and know throughout these other weeks of this split.
And honestly, again, Mickey and Upset coming in and kind of shoring up some of the chaos issues that we saw out of Fnatic, not knowing how to play different game states. That's less of a question mark for me. The main one now going forward is, can Oscarinen hold his own in Fearless against guys like Mirwin, against Kana, who's obviously leveled up against Broken Blade, who's been running the LEC the last couple of years?
And unfortunately, history is going to tell us that can be a pain point. That can be a weak point that can be exploited for these teams approaching Fnatic in these situations. Again, I come back to the pressure scenarios and the guys that have been there and been part of the success throughout these other moments. And then the failures and all these crucial ones is Razork and Humanoid. And so many times we talk about them, talking about the pressure that they need to be under and need to be performing for this Fnatic team. I think we're almost at that absolute tipping point where it's got to go one way or the other, and you got to make a pivot point from here, because this is becoming incredibly frustrating for the Fnatic faithful.
And it's a rarity that we have G2 coming into one of these lists not as the top dog. They're taking down a peg in that 2 spot, and maybe if how the first 2 series at first stand went for K Corp, maybe if they bowed out early and just never really showed anything, you might be putting an angle to have G2 as that top dog. But because they have that bounce back, because they show up in a big way and are even competitive in those finals, or at least get to those finals, then you're feeling pretty confident about this team continuing to grow and helping to raise the rest of the level of the LEC.
I want to give a little shout out to G2 and the expectation that things are going to continue to improve, continue to build that familiarity and trust with players like Skewmon and Lebrov.
And they're going to be motivated now after losing in that fashion.
Yes, but we do need to give the crowning moment here to Karmine Corp. Yes, not Karmine Corpse. It's Karmine Corp. They showed up at first stand for the LEC. They showed up through the winter split in a way that they had never done before in their history. And now we are celebrating them as the #1 team heading towards this spring split for the LEC, a team that is heading with international experience under their belt, now heading to an international finals. Yeah, I know not so many teams at first stand and everything else, but still got to give them the medal when they have achieved something like this. And I think what you saw from them at first stand is the more important thing when you're talking about them heading into this next split, and how you can set the tone for the region as this representative from an international event. Very excited about this. Another split for Khalees and what we can see from him. Vladdy in the mid lane already proving himself to be better than expected throughout the international scene. Very much so looking forward to what we can see from K Corp in this next turnaround in the LEC.
And again, the big mental bounce back that this team has already showcased multiple times. First stands the obvious one, having the abysmal 0-2 start to bounce back to be the only. I mean, they handed Hanwha 2 of their 3 losses at the whole event, which, you know, I know seems like a copium type of thing, but Hanwha Life's a bit of a beast in case you haven't watched the first quarter of this year. And even going back to the LEC finals, losing to G2, and then bouncing back to 3-0 them in finals. So the mental strength that this team has already as a relatively young roster is one of the main reasons we're very high on them heading into this split. But don't discount an actual motivated G2 who kind of got slapped across the face, especially Caps and Broken Blade, who all the teaser videos, all they're saying is, we run this region, we have the trophy, it's ours. Well, no, it's not yours anymore, and you gotta retake it.
And it's very quickly become a narrative that this is always and will always be Karmine Corp's region now, right? They have the fan base, they have the energy, all these type of things. Now they're putting up the results. They're bringing in a trophy case. They're representing the region at these international events. Yes, you better believe that there is going to be a fired up G2 response to this type of win. And I can't wait. I think we are going to have a very action-packed, very up and down type of split within the LEC, and it's always going to be one heck of a drama to check in with.
Yeah, and Karmine Corp, I think, will and should be the favorites for the spring split based on what we got. But you look at anyone in that top 4, G2, Fnatic, and maybe an outside Movistar KOI if they can shore some things up. And I think anyone in that top 4 could be taking home the spring title.
Karmine Corp, the biggest thing for me is you can't rest on your laurels. You can't take this as, we did it. We had a wonderful winter split. We weren't last. We're first. We went to the international event. We did well. We represented. All good. Check mark for 2025. No, it ain't over. Job's not done. You get back out there. You keep working hard. You keep pushing to be as good as you can be. Otherwise, it ain't just going to be these LEC teams that are eating you up. It'll be everybody else, and you're not even going to get an opportunity to be represented in those things. So let's see you keep working hard.